America is drowning in debt. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean the United States government currently owes more than $38.5 trillion. $38.5 trillion. That's a number so large, it barely even registers as real anymore. To put that in perspective, if you spent $1 million every single day, it would take you almost 100,000 years to spend $38.5 trillion. And yet, somehow, that's exactly how much debt the richest country in the world has managed to accumulate. But here's what's really wild. Nobody seems to care. Politicians talk about it during election season, then immediately forget about it once they're in office. The media mentions it occasionally, then moves on to the next crisis. And the average person? They hear the number, feel vaguely worried for about 5 seconds, then go back to their normal life. Because what are you supposed to do about it anyway? But today, we're going to talk about what's actually happening with America's debt, why it's spiraling out of control, and why this might be the biggest economic crisis nobody's paying attention to. Let's start with the basics, because most people don't actually understand what government debt is or how it works. When we say America has $38.5 trillion in debt, what that really means is that the US government has borrowed $38.5 trillion that it hasn't paid back yet. But who did it borrow from? Well, a lot of different places. Some of it is owed to foreign countries like China and Japan. Some of it is owed to American citizens who bought government bonds. Some of it is actually owed to other parts of the US government itself, like Social Security. Basically, whenever the government spends more money than it collects in taxes, which it does every single year, it has to borrow money to cover the difference. And that borrowed money accumulates into what we call the national debt. Simple enough, right? Except here's where it gets complicated. Debt isn't necessarily a bad thing. Countries, like people, sometimes need to borrow money. You might take out a mortgage to buy a house or a loan to start a business. That's not automatically a disaster. The question is whether you can afford to pay it back and whether you're borrowing for something worthwhile. And that's where America's story starts to fall apart. Here's the uncomfortable truth. America's debt isn't growing because of some one-time emergency or a temporary crisis. It's growing because the US government spends way more money than it brings in, and it's been doing that for decades. Every single year, the government creates a budget. And every single year, that budget includes more spending than revenue. The difference is called the deficit. And the deficit gets added to the national debt year after year after year. It's like having a credit card that you max out every month, then getting a new credit card to pay off the old one, then maxing that one out too, and just repeating the cycle forever. Eventually, you're not even paying off the original purchases anymore. You're just paying interest on debt you accumulated years ago. And that's exactly where America is right now. Let's talk about how we got here, because this didn't happen overnight. For most of American history, the national debt was relatively manageable. It would spike during wars, which makes sense because wars are expensive, and then it would come back down during peacetime. After World War II, the debt was actually higher as a percentage of the economy than it is today. But the country paid it down over the next few decades through economic growth and disciplined spending. Everything was more or less under control, but then something changed. Starting in the 1980s, the debt started growing faster and faster. Why? Because politicians figured out that they could win elections by promising people more stuff without raising taxes to pay for it. They could cut taxes, which made voters happy, and increase spending on programs people liked, which also made voters happy. And the cost? That just got added to the debt, which was a problem for future politicians to deal with. So that's exactly what they did. Democrats wanted more social programs. Republicans wanted lower taxes and bigger military budgets. And neither side wanted to be the one to say no to anything, because saying no loses elections. So they just kept borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. And for a long time, it seemed like it didn't matter. The economy kept growing, interest rates were low, America could borrow money cheaply, so why not? Other countries were happy to lend to the US because American government bonds were considered the safest investment in the world. It was like having a credit card with no limit and almost no interest rate. Of course, you're going to use it. But here's the problem: that situation doesn't last forever. And right now, we're starting to see the cracks. The first crack is the sheer size of the debt. $38.5 trillion is not just a big number, it's bigger than the entire US economy. America's gross domestic product, which is the total value of everything the country produces in a year, is around $31.8 trillion. That means the debt is now bigger than the entire economy. Imagine if you made $50,000 a year but owed $70,000. That's uncomfortable, but maybe manageable if the interest rate is low. But what if the interest rate goes up? What if you suddenly have to start paying $5,000 a year just in interest? Now you're in trouble. And that's exactly what's happening to America right now. Interest rates have gone up dramatically over the past few years. For over a decade, after the 2008 financial crisis, interest rates were basically zero. The Federal Reserve kept them low to stimulate the economy, which meant the government could borrow money for almost nothing. But then inflation hit, prices started rising, and the Federal Reserve had to raise interest rates to try to control it. Which means now, the US government is paying way more interest on its debt than it used to. In fact, the amount of money the government spends just on interest payments has become one of the largest parts of the federal budget. We're talking over $1 trillion a year just on interest, not paying down the debt, not funding programs, just interest. That's more than the country spends on defense, more than it spends on education, just servicing the debt, and that number's only going to get bigger. Here's where it gets really scary. Because the debt is so large and interest rates are higher, the government has to borrow even more money just to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed. Let that sink in for a second. America's now borrowing money to pay interest on its debt. It's the financial equivalent of taking out a payday loan to make your credit card payment. And anyone who's ever been in that situation knows exactly how that story ends. You get trapped in a cycle where the debt grows faster than you can possibly pay it off. And eventually, the whole thing collapses. Now, you might be wondering, why doesn't the government just stop spending so much money? Why don't they cut programs, raise taxes, and pay down the debt like a responsible adult? Great question. And the answer is politics. Because here's the reality: most of the federal budget is locked in. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense spending, and interest on the debt. Those 5 things make up the vast majority of federal spending, and all of them are basically untouchable politically. You can't cut Social Security without losing the votes of every retiree in the country. You can't cut Medicare without being accused of wanting grandma to die. You can't cut defense without being called weak on national security. And you obviously can't just not pay the interest on the debt, because that would trigger a global financial crisis. So what's left? The small slice of discretionary spending, which includes things like education, infrastructure, scientific research, and everything else the government does. You could cut that entire category to zero and you still wouldn't come close to balancing the budget. The math just doesn't work. And raising taxes, also politically toxic. Nobody wants to be the politician who raises taxes, especially not enough to actually make a dent in a $38.5 trillion debt. So everyone just kicks the can down the road. They pass budgets that add to the debt, they give speeches about fiscal responsibility, and they hope the problem doesn't explode on their watch. It's a game of financial hot potato, and eventually, someone's going to be left holding the bag when the music stops. So what happens when a country has too much debt? History gives us some clues, and none of them are good. Option 1 is default. The country just says, "We can't pay, we're done." That would be catastrophic. US government debt is the foundation of the entire global financial system. If America defaults, every market crashes, every currency collapses, and we're talking about a depression that makes 2008 look like a minor inconvenience. So that's probably not going to happen. Option 2 is austerity. The government massively cuts spending and raises taxes to pay down the debt. Sounds responsible, but it's incredibly painful. It means cutting benefits that people rely on, raising taxes on everyone, and basically accepting years or even decades of economic stagnation. No politician wants to do that because it's career suicide. Option 3, and this is the one most economists think is most likely, is inflation. The government doesn't technically default, but it lets inflation run high, which devalues the debt over time. If you owe $1 trillion and then inflation makes the dollar worth half as much, suddenly your debt is easier to pay off. Of course, that also means everyone's savings are worth half as much, prices double, and the average person gets destroyed financially. But the government's debt becomes more manageable. It's a stealth default. You're not refusing to pay. You're just paying back with money that's worth way less than what you borrowed. And here's the kicker, that might already be happening. Inflation over the past few years has been the highest it's been in decades. Prices have exploded. Your dollar doesn't buy what it used to. And while the Federal Reserve claims they're fighting inflation, there's a part of this that's actually convenient for the government. Because every year inflation runs hot, the real value of that $38.5 trillion shrinks a little bit. It's a way to reduce the debt without actually paying it off. The problem is, it destroys the wealth of everyone who holds dollars, which is basically everyone. So, what does all of this mean for you? It means that the safety and stability you think exists might be an illusion. It means that the dollar you're saving, the retirement account you're building, the financial future you're planning for, all of that is tied to a system that's running on borrowed time and borrowed money. It means that at some point something has to give. Either the government finds a way to get spending under control, which seems politically impossible, or the debt keeps growing until it triggers a crisis that forces a solution, whether that's massive inflation, austerity, or something even worse. And when that happens, the people who suffer the most won't be the politicians who created the problem. It'll be regular people who did everything right, who saved their money, who played by the rules, and who wake up one day to find out that the rules changed and their financial security evaporated. This is the reality nobody wants to talk about. America's debt isn't just a number on a spreadsheet, it's a ticking time bomb. And every year it gets bigger. Every year interest payments consume more of the budget. Every year politicians refuse to make hard choices. We get one step closer to a reckoning that's going to reshape the entire economy. You can't borrow forever. You can't spend more than you make forever. And you can't keep kicking the can down the road forever. Eventually, you run out of road. And when America does, the whole world is going to feel it. So the next time someone asks what's happening with America's debt, the answer is simple. It's spiraling out of control, nobody's doing anything about it, and we're all just hoping it doesn't explode before we figure out what to do. That's what's happening, and that's why you should be paying attention.